So, welcome to this session, which is called Two Steps Forward, One Step Back. Martin Luther King once said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And when he said that, he was talking about the fact that it doesn't bend in a straight curve. There are kinks in this curve, that the bend is not true, if you like. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about, I think, today, that in the progress of any struggle, there are setbacks. How do we deal with them? What do they mean? How does that inform what we do? My name is Gary Young. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester, author, broadcaster, and formerly editor-at-large of The Guardian. And I'm joined by, going from right to left, your left to my right, Caroline Bird, poet and playwright; Peter Tatchell, campaigner and director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation; Kerry Kennedy, president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization; and I was going to say on screen, but certainly on my screen, Sherry Lee Houston, actor, co-founder of Triple C, which runs the DANC, the Disabled Arts Network community. Now, Sherry Lee has to go early. She has a hospital appointment, and once you, it will become clear how that might be once she comes, here she is. And so I'm going to start the session by asking all of the guests, but starting with Sherry Lee, to reflect on that, the title of the session, Two Steps Forward, One Step Back, and to talk to us a little bit about how that informs their work, how it's informed their life and the organizations that they work in and with. Sherry Lee, welcome.
Hello, welcome, and thank you, Gary. Sorry, everybody, I've got to go for an MRI. These things always sort of clash, don't they, unfortunately. I'm a disabled actor. I've been in Coronation Street for 11 years, and I also run Triple C, which is an arts organisation set up to alter the way disabled people access the arts. And we run DANC, the Disabled Artists Network community. We've only been going 3 years with DANC, and we've got a community over 1,150 disabled creatives. And the reason we set that up is because as a disabled actor creative myself, we're always told that you're the only one. You're the only one who's there in people's peripherals, so therefore access becomes your responsibility rather than the responsibility of the room or your community. So I think we're definitely at a kink in the road, Gary, with the disabled community. Oh my goodness me. I think saying that this is two steps forwards, one step back. At the moment, it feels like my community is experiencing 10 steps back. The blatancy, sadly, of ableism is just astounding at the moment, and it's heartbreaking. It's utterly heartbreaking to realise that society really does not value you. If you all think back to that term when COVID started, of the word just those with underlying health conditions and the elderly that are going to die. Why is my life worth less than other people's? And why was that always put in the media as acceptable? And we all accepted it, and that word just used to cut through to my stomach and my heart. Last year, out of everybody who sadly died because of COVID, 59% of them were disabled people. Now, that's not in the news. What the news did was perpetuate that word just. If you put those statistics on any other community, how heartbreaking would that be? How much would we be up in arms saying that is abhorrent, And yeah, it's incredibly sad, And at the same time, some phenomenal changes happened with people's acceptance of everybody in the room suddenly. Do you know what I mean? In the arts, there's been this massive, massive shift. And I can see that within our community. We used to be banging on people's doors to talk to us, and now they want to talk to us. It doesn't take an hour to persuade people to work with us. They want to work with us. So in my career, it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back because of the way, we've all been impacted by COVID. In my personal life, as a disabled person, I'm terrified with what's happening. At the moment, they're taking money off people's benefits to pay for their care, when most of our care was half of our care was cut not even 10 years ago. Now we don't get care for help around the house. People are put in nappies, to speak for a better word, than having somebody there to help them toilet them. All the time, 24-hour care is quite often gone. So at the moment, disabled people are really fighting for their lives. But I think what's phenomenal, and it feels like we've been in the slipstream of Black Lives Matter, fantastically, thankfully, that movement has created such a shift in people's perceptions of what is right and what is just. I hate the words equality and diversity, because actually we're all just humans, and stop segregating people. So in a way, I think what's changing in our arts and our industry, the fact that you will start to include us, because we're 20% of the population, we are 1 in 5, and that's going up. Before COVID, it was 14.1 million people. There's at least 1 million people who are now disabled with long COVID, and that fearfully could be more.
I just want to ask, sorry, Sherry, because I know we're going to lose you, where do you see the 1 step forward coming from in this moment?
The arts.
The arts.
The arts are going to do this. The arts are going to go, actually, why have we not been including you? And of course, those are really creative solutions when you bring in disabled creatives. And actually, we will see different stories, we will see different artwork, we will see so much change. And the arts lead the way. The arts tell our stories. The arts reflect the community back at ourselves. And that's how society learns. And that's where the arts really need to push this now.
Sherry Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with your MRI.
Thank you very much. Sorry I can't stay for this valuable
discussion. No, not at all. I hope to see you vertically one day.
Thank you.
Take care. I wanted to move to you, Kerry, and ask you the same question. The 2 steps forward, 1 step back. How does that relate to what you do?
Well, I would start with 1 step back. So I think the biggest challenge to human rights in the world today is not a government or an army, but it's hatred. And that's Boko Haram in Nigeria. It's the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism across Europe. It is so many of the issues we've discussed here for the last several days in the UK. It's, the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar and the overtaking of that government by the military and the persecution of the Karen and so many other tribal people. It's the Uyghurs in China. And in the United States, of course, it's personified by the rise of Donald Trump, whose entire, if you could name one thing that's totally consistent, which is hard to do, in his administration, it was hatred. So I think that that's kind of the battle that all of us need to take on. And in a way, it makes me happy because it's a battle that each of us can wage. I don't like using the metaphor of war for this, but because it's very inappropriate. But each of us in our own lives can walk through life with tenderness and with caring and with love, and treating one another with respect, and I think in dignity. And so each of us has a role to play in changing that society. The 2 steps forward, I think there have been dramatic changes in my life. You quoted Martin Luther King, and I think that his vision of history is absolutely right. Just think about what life was like 2,000 years ago and what it's like today, and how much more freedom there is, how much less suffering there is in day-to-day goings-on of humans all over the world. And you realize that what he said is absolutely true. I think since I started working on human rights 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, I think I said this the other day, but at the time I started, all of Latin America was under right-wing military dictatorships. Today, there's not one left standing. All of South Africa was at the height of apartheid. Today, it's had a series of freely elected governments elected by a majority of their people. Women's rights was not on the international agenda. Today, women's rights is discussed in virtually, by every country on earth in their international relations. And so I feel this great sense of hope. And then that is because in some ways, because of structural changes like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the laws that have come out of it. But mostly because of the rise of NGOs around the world, where people realize you don't have to be in government, you don't have to be rich, you don't have to have get your DNA checked in order to have power. You can do that by joining together with others and making demands, and that's what the Black Lives Matter movement has done. Okay, I realize I'm talking too long, but let me just give this one last example. Black Lives Matter, in the last 2 years, during the height of COVID, and this is very concrete, got corporate America to pledge $100 billion in investments in the Black community. $100 billion. That is real money, and that's real change. So I see evidence of this all over the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter.
I think it's good to look at history. And as we know, history doesn't go in a unilinear straight line. It's more snakes and ladders. I always think of Germany, one of the great European civilizations, a country that gave us Mozart, Einstein, Holbein, and many, many other great contributors to human civilization. And yet, in that country, in the 1930s and 40s, it descended into an unprecedented barbarism, which is unimaginable today. But if you'd said that to Germans 100 years ago, or a bit earlier, very few could have ever imagined such an enormous, gigantic step backwards. So it is a lesson from history that we have to learn and be mindful of, to not take anything for granted, to not be complacent, to not think that bad things cannot happen again. I wanted to perhaps address, because you asked me about my own experience, perhaps just address, although I do many human rights campaigns, the LGBT+ campaign in particular, and focusing here on Britain. The modern movement in this country began in the 1950s, and for really half a century, virtually no progress was made in terms of law reform. So that even up until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. And yet, just 14 years later, in 2013, with the legislation of same-sex marriage, all those laws in that period had been repealed. That is the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history, and I would suggest possibly in world history. I can't think of any other marginalized community that has suffered such institutional legal discrimination that has removed all those discriminations in such a short space of time. So that is a phenomenal example of progress. But here we are in 2021, and things seem to be at least static, if not moving backwards. We have a huge rise in the reported numbers of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic hate crimes in Britain. A huge rise, many times greater than just 6 years ago in 2015. We also have the government having promised to ban LGBT plus conversion therapy over 3 years ago, and it still hasn't happened. Similarly, the government did a public consultation exercise on reforming the Gender Recognition Act, which the overwhelming majority of people supported reform, and now it's been kicked into the long grass. We've had the government ditch its LGBT plus action plan and disband its LGBT plus advisory panel. Just in the last couple of days, we've had the so-called Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, making disparaging remarks about the LGBT plus community, particularly about trans people, dismissing their concerns, their struggles, and their rights. So it is a very mixed picture, and things are not as optimistic as they were a decade or more ago. Globally, of course, we see parallels. In the last half a century, more than 40 countries have decriminalized same-sex relations. Many in recent years, like India, Trinidad and Tobago, Angola, Bhutan, and so on. But in about 20 countries, there is now a very severe backlash. In Russia, Ghana, Uganda, Indonesia, in a whole raft of countries, the repression of LGBT plus communities has massively escalated through a combination of both new legal restrictions and more harsh interpretations of existing laws, but also mob homophobic violence as well. So it just reinforces the need to remain vigilant, to not take gains won for granted, and to realize that the struggle that we are a part of must continue until every person on this planet is free and equal.
And Caroline.
Hello. I thought I'd talk about a personal thing that happened recently. So, I mean, I came out to my parents when I was a teenager, and they were wonderful. But my partner only came out to her mom 2 years ago, and I remember at the time saying, you know, has she ever said anything homophobic? No. Well, you know, and she loves you. I think it's probably going to be all right. I mean, she's from a little village in Devon, and I thought, you know, I mean, what's the worst that can happen? It's really harming my partner, keeping it all inside. And then she told her, and the first thing that her mom said was, "You're not my daughter anymore." And then she said, "This is the worst thing I could hear about my daughter, second to hearing that you'd been in a car accident." And at that point, my Eliza would have been completely in her rights to go, right, I you know, I'm not going to speak to my mom anymore. But she didn't, and because she loves her. And 2 years later, I can honestly say that I really care about my future mother-in-law, and we have both seen her grow so much. And we're still, my partner's still incredibly traumatized by what was said, and nothing will ever undo that. And it shouldn't, the way that we've watched her learn is Eliza was put on an absolute charm offensive. We've invited her around over and over again, even when Eliza was crying in the car afterwards. And also, the biggest thing was the change in the rules of the Methodist Church recently. And now, which I mean, I never thought that, I mean, I'm not religious, and I never thought such a thing would be really important to me. But, you know, then you fall in love with someone and their mother really cares about their opinion of their Methodist priest, and then suddenly that has a huge effect on your life. And now we're getting married next year, and her mom keeps on ringing us about it, really excited all the time. But that thing about one step forward, two steps back, we have had to not say so many things we wanted to say and hold so much anger in and be so nice in reaction to such, you know, and it shouldn't have to be that way, right? You shouldn't have to convince someone through being utterly lovely and also, you know, them getting talked to by their friends at the church. But I think we're constantly coming across this clash between the way we think people should learn and the way that they do learn, you know. But I haven't really got an answer for it exactly, but I know that it feels like we've taken, me and my partner, especially my partner, has taken a lot of blows over these last 2 years for her mom's progress. And her mom has made that progress, and my partner has taken the impact. You know, there's been a cost to her in order for her mom to progress, and that's not a perfect way of things happening, but it has happened, and that's not an easy answer, and I don't know what the answer is, but just quickly, the change in the Methodist law really did make a difference, because sometimes I think people think they care about beliefs, but actually what they care about is the way things are. And so if you change the way things are like that, suddenly people go, oh, and they forget about their beliefs suddenly. So that seems really important. Anyway, thank you.
Caroline, that was very moving, and actually it reminded me of a quote from a character in Armistead Maupin's Maybe the Moon, who's a little person, and she says, when you're my size and not being tormented by elevator buttons, water fountains, and ATMs, you spend your life accommodating the sensibilities of normal people. You learn to bury your own feelings and honor theirs in the hope that they'll meet you halfway. It becomes your job and yours alone to explain, to ignore, to forgive over and over again. There's no way you can get around this. You do it if you want to have a life and not spend it being corroded by your own anger. You do it if you want to belong to the human race. And that sense of emotional labor that you have to put in is I mean, it's both exhausting and sadly sometimes necessary. But I mean, I think we're all moved by your testimony there. I want to just dwell a bit on a couple of the examples that you used, Peter, and kind of open it out to everybody, because in essence, that example of Germany and the example of Britain, both what was good and what was bad, you were saying that we can't take anything for granted, including our success. That things, and this kind of follows on from what I was saying before, things can happen at a rate and a pace that you can't foresee. That can be for the better and for the worse. And so the steps forward and the steps back, it's like we're taking these steps in the dark, almost. And I'm just wondering how we navigate that. You know, there was that great phrase from the anti-globalization protesters that a better world is possible. But there's also the fact that a worse world is possible too. And sometimes it's not clear. We can be almost taking a step forward with one foot and a step back with another one. I'm just wondering how we kind of understand that as kind of activists and people who are engaged. I'm going to start with you, Peter, but everybody else, please kick in.
I can remember as a young teenager asking my parents and other adults, how did people let Hitler come to power? Why wasn't he stopped before he did all these bad things? No one could give me an answer. But I remember thinking to myself, if I ever see something similar, I will do something, and I will urge other people to do something. And I was growing up in Australia at the time of the Vietnam War, and Australia was involved with the Americans in that dreadful war. And like most Australians, I was convinced it was a right and just war until I began to investigate and scrutinize the facts, the history. And when I discovered the mass carpet bombing of civilian areas, the massacres by US and other Allied troops of innocent civilians, that turned me against the war and motivated me to become involved in the Vietnam Moratorium campaign in my home city of Melbourne, Australia. We organized, we came up with the idea of a general strike to stop the war. But we knew the term general strike would not have a wider public resonance. So we changed it. We called it Stop Work to Stop the War. And in 1970, in Melbourne, on the first moratorium protest, we had 100,000 people blockade the entire city centre. This was at a time when Melbourne had a population of only 1 million. So 10% of the entire population turned out. And that was the turning point. The government, the Conservative government at the time, saw the writing on the wall that public opinion was against the war. And soon afterwards, a Labour government was elected, troops were withdrawn, the draft was ended. So it shows that change is possible, but it shows you have to recognise that an injustice is taking place and do something about it. I think I'll finish there and let others come in.
I mean, I'm intrigued, before I go to you, Kerry or Caroline, the point you make about, you said to yourself, I will not be that person, I will not let this happen, I will say something. I'd really like to think that I would also do that, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I think it's kind of, I'm sure there were lots of people at the time who saw it and they thought it was wrong. But it's like the frog in the water. How do you know the turning point at which you intervene? What about your personal set? All of these things kind of, I always like to think I would never, not on my watch, I would always, and I'm just being honest, I always think, well, these things that you mentioned, the Rohingya, all of these acts of hatred, I'd like to think that in every instance I would be one of the people, one of the handful of people maybe who said, this is outrageous. And I'm just being honest, I can never quite convince myself that that I would be. I'd like to think I would, but I don't know. I mean, how do we deal with that? Good people doing nothing, or paralyzed.
Yeah, it reminds me of that great quote from Elie Wiesel. He said, "The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference." So, that's really the issue, right? It's one of indifference, but in my experience, people, if they see something wrong, they will not get involved if they think there's nothing they can do, if what they could do would be ineffective. So I think that part of our job as activists is showing people that they, empowering people, showing people that you have the power, you can make a difference. It might not be a huge difference, but you can make a difference. I'll tell you an example of this in my life. I was doing a TV show in the Philippines, and it was in a very, very remote part of the Philippines. And so I was living in New York, and I got in a car, and I went to JFK Airport, and then I flew from JFK to Tokyo, and that was, 12 hours, and then another 6 hours to to the Philippines, and then about another 5 hours to this tiny little island. And then I got on a bus and I went for 14 hours, and then I hiked up into a mountain about 5 hours, and I got to a little stream, and the story was on the other side of the stream. So there's no way of passing the stream, so I'm standing there for about, half a day, and along comes a guy with a canoe. And he says, I'll take you across. So the crew, we were with CNN, the crew and I get in this canoe, and we go across. We get to the other side. He says, here's my card in case you need anything. I was like, well, thank you very much. So we go and do the story. We're there for 3 weeks, and we get back to New York, and I get married, and then I have twins. And this is now 5 years later, and I come home from the hospital with the twins. I've never changed a diaper in my life. I'm like completely overwhelmed. I have no idea what to do. And I pick up my mail, and there's a letter. Dear Carrie, you might not remember me. I had a canoe. And he says, I'm now on death row for a crime I didn't commit, and they are going to execute me. Could you please intervene on my behalf? Now, I had no idea if this guy is innocent or guilty. Know nothing about him. Of course, he was just, I got a ride in the canoe. So I have a little letter in my laptop that says, Dear Governor, I'm against the death penalty for this litany of reasons. And so I printed that out, and I signed it, and I put it in an envelope, and I sent it off. And I thought, that's all I can do. I got too much else going on. I can't figure this out. That's what I can do. 3 years later, I get a letter back saying, Dear Carrie, thank you very much. They commuted my sentence. So, wow. That's an extraordinary moment of saying there's not, this is, so you don't have to take on the world. It's not necessarily your job at that moment to change a law or to march into parliament or organize 100,000 people. It's amazing if you can do that. You don't have to do it all. You can do something. And the question is, do something. When you see something wrong, figure out a way to do something.
I guess the question, in a sense, and this is my last question to the panel before I'm going to open it out to the audience, is that sometimes you write the letter and the person does die. Sometimes you organize a demonstration and the war continues.
Sure.
That's the step back. I mean, there were people in Britain, certainly, who said, well, we marched against the war, and the war still happened. And so how do we give sustenance or comfort or inspiration in those moments when the story doesn't turn out the way that has been mentioned here, which are very kind of uplifting stories, but sometimes it doesn't end so well. Sorry to be a downer.
Shall I ever go?
But a session that's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, sometimes there's a step back.
Yeah, I've been involved in left politics since my teenage years. And in those early teenage years, I had the optimism of, radical social change, real social justice, to fundamentally shift the balance of wealth and power in society. And here I am, more than 5 decades later, and it hasn't happened. And, that is very dispiriting. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, Kerry, there have been enormous gains for women, black and ethnic minority peoples, LGBTs, people with disabilities, and many, many others. Not enough change, not enough progress, but certainly great progress compared to when I was a kid. So, I think you have to balance the fact that sometimes you win on some issues and not on others. Sometimes you make gains and go a bit back, but overall you make progress. I think back to Section 28, the Conservative government's ban on so-called promotion of homosexuality in 1988. It was the first knew anti-gay law in Britain for a century. Astonishing that that could happen in the post-war period. And it was an attack upon our community, but it also had a silver lining, because it mobilized our community in a way that nothing else ever had. And we have to thank Margaret Thatcher, damn her soul, for bringing together the LGBT plus community in a way that had never happened before. We became a real, effective political force as a result of Section 28. So sometimes even the bad things have a silver lining.
Kerry, is there anything you'd like to add?
Excuse me?
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think, first of all, I would say that I get my inspiration from people around the world who are out there facing imprisonment and torture and death for basic rights most of us take for granted, and they're the Martin Luther Kings of their countries. So, yeah, it doesn't work all the time. Look at the NAACP that started in the 1910s, and it took until 1963 to pass or 1964 to pass the Voting Rights Act. So sometimes we're in it for a long struggle and you keep going. I think the thing that gets in our way is our ego. So, because we say, well, I tried and it should have worked, and now I'm upset. Well, no, that's not all right. So I think, when you find yourself, I don't know, when I find myself feeling like that, I try to think, I asked myself 3 questions. Is this about my need for safety and survival? And then let go of that. Is this about my need for power and control? And let go of that. Is this about my need for affection and esteem? And let go of that. And if you can let go of your ego need to succeed, you can focus on the next step.
Thank you. Well
For me, it's when I read poems, not all poems, but poems that I love, because it's like this kind of direct phone line into somebody else's interior world. And it's not necessarily about the content of the poem, it's about the interiority of the poem, and it makes me remember that I can trust in the chaos of people's minds. Because when you look at the news, it's so easy to think, God, behind all of these faces there's just some kind of dead mush that wants to ruin us. And there's something about being able to remember that everyone else has this centered place, and it is changing, and it is living, and it can grow, as you said earlier this morning, Gary, and that we have to keep the belief in that, the belief in these very improbable shifts and transformations inside people's heads that often happen when we're not noticing, or happen in the strangest incidental moments. And yes, they might not happen when we think they should, and they might happen in the corridor instead, but they do happen.
I'm going to open it out to the audience. I, as an activist, as an active trade unionist at The Guardian and active anti-racist, I always say to people that fighting is no guarantee of victory, but not fighting is a guarantee of defeat. So we fight, and you learn, and you grow from the fight. And, if the fight had a guaranteed victory, then it wouldn't probably be much of a fight, would it? Please, if you raise your hands, we have people with microphones, anything you'd like to contribute. There's a gentleman down here in the middle, so conveniently for you.
Hiya. The question I'd like to ask, in a world where the poor are getting poorer and poorer, and the rich are getting richer and richer, the lack of opportunity is getting less for working class. Things like the demise of the trade union movement and its membership. How can we encourage and enable the working class and the poorer sections of society, which are the majority and also reflect us all, whether our colour, background, sexuality, etc. How do we help, support, enable and empower this large section of the world population? So if anyone could tell me their ideas on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, just a little one there. Either of you?
Yeah.
Any of you? Peter?
To me, it is extraordinary that we live in a society where we all expect political democracy, but we live in a society where there is no economic democracy. There is a complete disjunction between the economic and political systems. We are living under an economic dictatorship, a dictatorship of the rich. They control everything. You know, in terms of economic power, it's the big investors, the pension funds, the managers, the directors, the major shareholders. These are the people that decide and determine the economy. The people who work in both private and public institutions have no power. Even our public institutions are run like private companies, with bosses at the top and workers below with no meaningful say. To me, it's absolutely extraordinary that there isn't a big campaign for economic democracy. And it goes back to my earlier question about my frustration as a left-winger that the left has not made progress. The left hasn't made progress because people on the left are not articulating these ideas. You know, even Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing Labour leader since George Lansbury in the 1930s, he was talking about welfare statism. You know, a better deal for people who are unemployed or sick or disabled. You know, more government investment in, you know, the railways and other education, healthcare and so on, bringing the public utilities back into public ownership. But he wasn't talking about changing the structures of power in the economy. He wasn't talking about democratizing the NHS so the grassroots workers in the biggest employer in the country and the world actually have some power. And this isn't just about justice, this is also about making those institutions work better. At my local hospital, they have an appalling appointment system. Every time I have to go there, I say, look, can't you work out a system where I get an appointment at 2 o'clock and I'm still waiting at 4:30? And they said, yes, well, we agree, but we don't have the power. You know, back in the 1970s, a right-wing Labour government led by James Callaghan set up the Bullock Commission to look at industrial democracy. Lord Bullock came back with the proposal that every company with more than 50 employees would have to, by law, appoint equal numbers of employee directors to the management board of every company. And the chair of the board would have to be mutually agreed by the employer's side and the employee side. The most radical proposal for social justice and democracy in Britain in the last 100 years. What happened? The trade unions vetoed it, saying it was corporatism. I mean, I can remember as a young left-wing activist pleading with trade unions and my own trade union and others, this will give you power. This will give you a place at the table. You'll have access to corporate information, the right to vote on key decisions affecting your members. Well, the response to that proposal, I was heartbroken for years afterwards because I saw an opportunity there and lost. I'm not saying it would have been perfect or would have been the bee's knees or the solution, but it would have massively empowered ordinary working people. So I think we need to start articulating these ideas to make the case for economic democracy, to challenge the idea that managers, directors, major shareholders have all the votes while the ordinary employee is disenfranchised.
Thank you, Peter. We are now at the end of the panel discussion. We have timed out. Could have gone for a lot longer. I think I wish it could. But at this point, I want to invite Caroline. Caroline? Caroline.
Yeah.
Our poet and playwright, to share with us Article 16
Sure.
and to, if you could briefly explain
Of course.
what made you write this poem.
So Article 16 is men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality or religion have the right to marry and found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage and in its dissolution. I was surprised that the word sexuality still wasn't in there. I think if it was, it might change how I feel about the last section. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and entitled to protection by society and the state. I know that personally, if sexuality was in the first bit, it would make me feel better about the word natural, and I would feel included in that. But you know, I'm a gay, divorced woman with a toddler who lives half the week with my ex, and I'm getting married again for the last time next year. You know, so I do believe in marriage, but I also have had a messy relationship to it. And I remember when I got divorced, I felt such shame. I know everyone feels shame when they get divorced, but I felt like I had this fear like I'd not only let myself down, I'd let gay marriage down, and I'd got everyone to come to a gay wedding in the first place, and then it had been a massive failure, and it caused me to cut off a large amount of my family for a long time, even though they hadn't asked me to do that, just because I was so ashamed. And it's taken me a long time to realize that legalizing gay marriage meant that I had the right to make the same mistakes as everybody else and have a failed marriage and try again. And that's what it's about. It's not just about a picture postcard of two people proving that they can love each other, you know. Anyway, so this is a poem called The Mood. It's a bit about that. It's also about trying to maintain a sex life whilst just surrounded by Lego. It's called The Mood. I'm in the mood, she says, and there it is, opal-flamed and fierce around her head. And then her phone dings, and it wobbles like a tin ashtray, casting sparks over the rug. It's Mom, it's fine. But a starry tuft sheds and fidgets sideways to braid the banister. She steps on a Lego, whelps, fluorescent handprints up the stairway as she leaves me to blow out the candles, wax still stinging in their sockets. Softly, softly, one groan from the baby monitor. I swipe the air and a thin layer glitters my finger. The laundry basket squirms with fireballs like night vision puppies, and I find her charged particles dotting the sink like lost teeth, glowing clumps in the plug hole. Already she's been bled, the house eating her mood without wiping its bricky mouth, hot crumbs everywhere. I navigate tiny pyres on the landing, cindered in pepper pot piles, each stain and flung sock shining now like blood remembered under UV, a runway blinking me to bed, just where we left it, dark as a whale in rumpled water. I hang a coat hanger. She stacks a book and releases a sigh, visible and gold, swirling up around us in magnetized filings, marshalling into a heart shape, then a crib, then a credit card, a crucifix, her reflection creased in a river that changes with a splash into my face, my son's, my ex's, her mom's, all five mashed together in this luminous puree, flooding the room with brightness, harsh as a closing nightclub, a primary school foyer, and we look at each other with the dimmer switch up and our clothes all zips and buttons and our skin too warm before we clamber in the sheets to make love in the light of our life.
I want to thank you all, Caroline, Peter, Kerry. I think we all wish Sherilyn well. Thank you, the audience. I'm Gary Young. Have a great lunch, and we'll see you after lunch. Bye.